Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar session for applicants on PCCD's 2023-24 School Safety and Security School District Meritorious Grants Program. My name is Sam Cook, and I serve as Director of Policy and Planning within PCCD's Executive Director's Office. I'm joined by a couple of PCCD colleagues who will be helping to co-present and facilitate today's session. So Kirsten, do you want to say hello to the group?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Kirsten Kenyon, and I'm the Director of the Office of Research, Evaluation, and Strategic Policy Development here at PCCD. And my office has the distinct pleasure of overseeing our school safety unit.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. So before we dive in officially, let's go over just a couple of quick housekeeping rules. We will be recording today's webinar, and it will be posted on our website as soon as it becomes available. And we'll also be posting a copy of today's PowerPoint slides for your reference and download. We do encourage you to take a moment, if you haven't already, to just double check your audio settings to make sure you can hear today's presentation well. Please note that on this platform, we cannot hear you. And that's sort of by design with the platform. We appreciate, however, all of the questions that folks submitted in advance of the session, and we've sort of designed today's presentation to hopefully address most of those common burning areas. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can also ask some additional questions if you still have them after today's session. So moving towards today's agenda, we will kick things off with a brief overview of our agency and then a recap of the school district meritorious grants funding announcement and application process. We'll cover the anticipated funding timeline, including some important upcoming deadlines. We'll then spend the bulk of our presentation talking about those frequently asked questions that I just mentioned. And just a friendly reminder that you can view all of the questions that we've fielded to date, including responses to those in the funding announcement question and answer section of our active funding announcements webpage. So all that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. So first, a little bit about our agency for folks who may not be familiar. The Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, or PCCD, as we're more commonly known, was established a little more than 45 years ago in 1978 through Pennsylvania state law. We serve as the Commonwealth's Justice, Planning, and Policy Making Agency, and our mission is to enhance the quality, coordination, and planning within the criminal and juvenile justice systems, to facilitate the delivery of services to victims of crime, and to increase the safety of our communities. We're a relatively small state agency housed within the executive office with about 150 or so employees working across 4 different offices. And we're directed by an overarching commission board, which is advised by 7 different advisory committees and 2 training boards. And we also have our School Safety and Security Committee, which is responsible for oversight of school safety and security grant funds, among other school safety initiatives. So our responsibilities and programs fall into a number of different areas, including obviously funding and grants, technical assistance, data and research, victims compensation and services, training and professional development, and many, many more things. And so if you're interested in learning more about those areas, would highly encourage you to check out our website, which is available at pccd.pa.gov. So now I'd like to turn things over to Kirsten, our Director of Office of Research, Evaluation, and Strategic Policy Development, and overlord of our school safety unit, for a little bit about this year's solicitation.
Thanks, Sam. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. I'm going to provide you with an overview of the fiscal year 23-24 School District Meritorious Grants Program being administered by PCCD this year. Now, before we dive into the specifics of this particular funding announcement, we did want to call attention to the fact that the Meritorious Grant Program is just one of several school safety and security related solicitations recently announced by our agency. These include the School District Meritorious Grants, which is the program that we're talking about here today, the School Mental Health Grants solicitation, which is also a non-competitive formula-based solicitation that school districts and some other eligible school entities can request funding for. We have our competitive school safety grant solicitation, and as the name suggests, this is the competitive grants program. So school districts are among a quite large list of applicants for this particular solicitation. And then finally, we have our targeted school safety grants for non-public schools, which is a competitive funding announcement that's open for non-public schools, with intermediate units eventually going to be making formal application on their behalf to our agency. If you haven't done so already, we strongly encourage you to visit PCCD's school safety website to learn more information about all of these solicitations. We've also created school entity-specific one-pagers on our school safety and security overview page that outlines eligibility criteria and basic information about each of these funding opportunities to help you keep them straight. So let's get back to the focus of today's webinar session, which is the fiscal year 23-24 School District Meritorious Grants Program. As we've just covered, this funding announcement is part of a broader package of school safety and security program grant funding opportunities announced by our agency just last month. The primary purpose of the School District Meritorious Grants Program is to provide non-competitive grants to school districts for programs that address physical safety and security, as well as mental health and behavioral health supports and services. Now, some of the folks on this call may recall that the last time PCCD opened and awarded meritorious grants was back in fiscal year 2019 and 2020. So it's been a couple of years since we've opened this non-competitive solicitation up. And it's been a couple of years since it's been an option for school districts to utilize. For this fiscal year, a total of approximately $18.6 million in state funds is available to all school districts per Section 1306B, subparagraph F of the PA Public School Code. So now that we have a high-level picture of the funding opportunity, let's get into some of the details of this funding announcement. As noted previously, a total of $18.6 million in state funding has been set aside for the non-competitive formula-based fiscal year 23-24 school district meritorious grants solicitation. All school districts and only school districts are eligible per the law to apply for these funds. Funding is dependent upon the school district's 2021-2022 average daily membership, and the grant amount ranges between $30,000 to $45,000, depending upon the size of your average daily membership. The award ranges for this grant, since we know we've had some folks ask us about this, are actually set in law. You can find your school district's grant allocation in Appendix B of the written funding announcement. Again, per the law, only school districts may apply for these non-competitive funds. If we have anyone on this call that happens to not be a school district, please consider one of the other open school safety solicitations for grant opportunities. The School Safety and Security Committee has defined a meritorious application as an application from a school district to utilize an award from the School Safety and Security Fund to undertake one or more of the allowable activities under Section 1306-B, subparagraph J, activities numbered 1 through 30 of the PA Public School Code, provided, of course, that the application includes sound supporting rationale and justification for the proposed activity, and that the proposed activity is not otherwise supported through existing funding sources, for example, supplantation. So now I'm going to turn things back over to Sam to cover our eligible program activities.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. So school districts can use their meritorious grant funds to support any allowable programs and activities that are designed to enhance school security and improve mental health supports that are included under School Code Section 1306B, subparagraph J, numbers 1 through 30. So those include, but are not limited to, the areas that are shown on this slide, such as school security personnel, school counselors and mental health personnel and services, both employed and contracted. Activity 12, which is security planning and purchase of technology, a pretty broad category. And just a note that thanks to Act 33, school districts will no longer be required to submit a board letter for these items. We'll touch on that in a little bit more detail down the road. Funds can also support student and staff training programs, school safety and violence prevention, emergency preparedness plans and activities, strategies to address student behaviors, for example, school-based diversion programs, as well as classroom management strategies, among others. You can also use funds for school safety and security assessments that are aligned with the standards adopted by the School Safety and Security Committee, trauma-informed approaches to education, as well as school-based threat assessment and more. So one new area that we did want to highlight this year, the School Safety and Security Committee did endorse the inclusion of violence prevention programs, including community violence reduction activities that are under activity number 22 of section 1306B subparagraph J. So historically, that wasn't necessarily one of the areas that was lifted up for school entities to utilize funds for directly. And so we did just want to make sure that folks on this call were aware that that was a new change. So we certainly encourage school districts to carefully review all of the available and eligible project activities as you develop your meritorious applications for funding. And if you'd like to check out the full listing of these eligible activities without having to even navigate different sections of school code, please know that we do have a summary document available on our website where you can have a full listing of those eligible activities right at your fingertips. So now that we've covered what you can use meritorious grant funds for, let's talk a little bit about what you cannot. So the meritorious funding announcement does identify a number of ineligible program activities as well as expenses that applicants should be mindful of when you're building your application and budget. And those include any item that's not included in section 1306B subparagraph J 1 through 30 of the school code. That anything that's not listed there explicitly could be deemed ineligible. And we're also considering ineligible any expenses and activities that are explicitly referenced on page 8 of the written funding announcement that have been deemed ineligible by the School Safety and Security Committee. So again, we would strongly encourage you, if you haven't already, to carefully review and read through that written funding announcement document just to really be sure that your application and budget align with these funding guidelines. So speaking of funding guidelines, a couple of financial considerations for you all to chew on. We encourage applicants to just bear in mind a couple of these different financial considerations associated with this non-competitive funding announcement. So you should carefully review the competitive bidding and sole source procurement section of the written funding announcement. You can find that information starting on page 11. That section of the written funding announcement includes some important procurement related information and requirements for you to digest. Please note also that PCCD does have approval of all final budgets. And in addition, grant funds must be used to supplement, not supplant, or in other terms, replace existing spending on school safety and security and related efforts within a school district. So speaking of supplantation, this is an area that PCCD often receives questions about from applicants, and it was certainly a popular topic that came up in questions that were submitted by participants for today's webinar. So what exactly is supplantation, other than a very fun word to say? First, let's talk about what it isn't, because I think that actually provides a little bit more clarity when we're talking about this term. So PCCD generally would not consider the following to be supplantation. First would be requesting funds for the same purpose as a previous PCCD school safety grant. Another example would be items or personnel currently funded but not included or reoccurring in the school district's budget. So for example, if you have staff or items or programs that were paid for using other grant funds or one-off sources of income, so to speak. Another example of what we would not consider to be supplantation would be requesting additional funding to increase the hours for current personnel. For example, if you wanted to bump someone up from part-time coverage to full-time, or if you wanted to increase the number of hours that they would be available for services, or other just general program activity or capacity building efforts that kind of enhance beyond what you currently provide. So what we would consider to be supplantation would include what you see kind of on the right-hand side of that screen. So that includes requesting grant money for activities, personnel, or items that are currently included in the district's annual budget, as well as using funds to retroactively support expenses that were already purchased or procured. So, for example, using grant funds to pay ongoing expenses as part of a previously executed contract or purchase order. So we know that school districts are juggling a lot of different funding sources, including several from PCCD, and that this can sometimes be an area that's tricky to navigate. So if you have any questions about whether something is or isn't supplementation, we certainly encourage you to connect with us. You'll also have assigned fiscal staff where you can kind of get additional situation-specific clarification. So in addition to the financial considerations we've just covered, there are a couple of additional considerations that applicants should keep in mind for this funding announcement. So first is a brand new thing to think about and be mindful of. That is that Act 33 did amend the public school code to establish new requirements related to Section 1319-B, which relates to annual school safety incident data reporting to PDE, the Department of Education, and establishing memoranda of understanding with local law enforcement. So that's been a longstanding requirement here in Pennsylvania, but under these new amendments through Act 33 of 2023, any school district that fails to comply with those longstanding provisions of annual data collection or MOUs may not be awarded any grant administered by PCCD's School Safety and Security Committee. For example, the school safety grants like the Meritorious grants that we're talking about today. So we can't award any grants until a district has come into compliance with those requirements. So again, brand new thing for you to kind of chew on and think about. So the second, as with prior school safety grants administered by our agency, we did want to make school districts aware that under Pennsylvania state law, any sensitive information that is included within your applications for funding will not be accessible for inspection or duplication under the state's right to know law. So sensitive information under the law is defined as anything that's reasonably likely to result in a substantial or demonstrable risk of physical harm or personal security of staff or students. So a couple of other considerations we wanted to lift up. A lot of participants in school districts have asked about the connection between this funding announcement and PCCD's baseline criteria standards. Those standards were originally adopted by the School Safety and Security Committee back in 2021, and they were really born out of a desire to help inform school entities' decisions about physical security and behavioral health and mental health needs. So these standards were developed and very recently revised based on input from a multidisciplinary work group with representatives from the education field and public safety sectors and mental and behavioral health experts. And those standards do have criteria that's organized across multiple levels, with kind of the most basic foundational elements as level 1, and then more advanced criteria following at levels 2 and 3. So while we strongly encourage school districts to review and consider these standards, including some of the tools and resources we've developed, like self-assessment checklists and resource guides and webinars, districts are not required to use these standards to inform their request for non-competitive funding under the Meritorious grants solicitation. So just a note, and if you're already registered for tomorrow's school mental health webinar, this will be a preview. We do want to make sure that school districts know that those baseline criteria requirements for level 1 behavioral health are still in play for school mental health grants this year. So if you haven't already signed up for that webinar that'll take place tomorrow, definitely encourage you to do so. So finally, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, but just to make it official, thanks to changes that were made by Act 33 of 2023, board letters are no longer needed to justify Activity 12 expenses. So those are expenses related to security planning and purchase of security-related technology. We know that was a big, heavy lift for a lot of you, and certainly for our staff during recent rounds of funding. So we're really pleased that that is going to hopefully be a more streamlined process moving forward. So now I will turn things back over to Kirsten, who's going to guide us through the application process.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so as per usual, school districts must submit their Meritorious application using PCCD's eGrants system in order to receive funding. Applications must be submitted electronically in our system by 11:59 p.m. on February 29th, 2024. E-grants application process is pretty straightforward for the Meritorious grant application. We're asking for an executive summary, which includes a very short script asking you to supply how much you're applying for and what you'll be expending the funds on. We just ask that you please be sure to follow the script. And by the way, it does not need to be super long or in depth. Just generally tell us what you're coming in for. We use these executive summaries to pull them out and provide information to the committee. So the more accurate you are in your executive summary, the better off we all will be. We also have a section for program activities, which is that full listing of the 30 eligible program activities that Sam and I constantly rattle off about under section 1306-B subparagraph J. You will be asked to select the category or categories that best correspond with what you're seeking funding for. So please note, choose only those categories that best match your project. Again, we use what you select on the back end to help compile what schools are using this funding for to better inform the committee as to what schools are coming in for. So again, accuracy is very helpful. And finally, for the Meritorious grants, the budget detail section will ask you to provide line item information such as personnel information, benefits, consultants, training and travel, equipment and supplies, construction, and some other requests. The more detailed you are in this section, the better off you are, as our fiscal folks will return budget requests that are not completed correctly. As ever, applicants are strongly encouraged to carefully read and review the written funding announcement document prior to starting their application in PCCD's e-grant system. As most of you are probably familiar, our e-grant system has a timeout feature on it. So if you don't utilize the page you're on within a 20-minute time frame, it times you out of the system. And unfortunately, it does not automatically save your work. It's much easier to prep all of your materials in advance prior to entering it into our e-grant system. So if you still have questions about the funding announcement or any questions generally, first, check the current list of questions and answers, which are additional clarifications on the funding announcements that are based on all questions submitted from all applicants. And you can find that under our active funding announcements webpage on our website. I had mentioned earlier about our handy one-pager documents. We also have a link on that one-pager document to the Q&A section and the funding announcement section on our website. The Q&As are updated on a routine basis, and it's possible somebody has already asked your question and the answer is already there. So if you don't see a Q&A that corresponds to your question after reviewing that document, please email our resource account, ra-cd-sssc@pa.gov, and put the title of the funding announcement in the subject line. So now I'm going to turn things back over to Sam to run through some of the more common, frequently asked questions that we get about this solicitation.
Thanks, Kirsten. So one of the questions that we've received a couple of times is about how much money school districts are eligible to request under this funding announcement. So Kirsten covered it a little bit earlier, but just to cross that off and be triply sure, we are using requirements that are established in the school code related to maximum allocation. So under those statutory requirements, school districts are eligible to request between $30,000 and $45,000, depending on their 2021-2022 average daily membership. So you can see the specific ranges on that slide, depending on what your ADM looks like for that year. And if you're looking for your school district's maximum award amount, please check out the appendix of the written funding announcement where that information lives, and you should be able to find it pretty easily. Another question we've gotten is about whether this grant program will be offered every year or every other year. We don't have any crystal balls here at PCCD, so the short answer is that it depends. The Meritorious Grant Program for school districts is funded through state school safety and security grant program funds. So the availability of grant funding through this program really does depend on the appropriation of funds within the state budget. So I'm going to hand things back to Kirsten for our next set of FAQs.
Thanks, Sam. So how does this grant program differ from last year's school safety and security and school mental health grants program? Well, last year's School Safety and Security Grants program was written specifically as a formula-based process. That was specific to Act 55 of 2022. This year's school code amendments, which are all included in Act 33 of 2023, revised the grant program. While it kept the formula-based mental health grant program similar to how it was run last year, it did not specifically prescribe how additional funds allocated to the School Safety and Security Fund were to be allocated this year. Thus, the process for driving those funds out defaulted back to what was included in Section 1306-B of the law, which includes both a meritorious grant program for school districts and a competitive school safety grant program for various school entities. As Sam mentioned earlier, the last time we had a meritorious grant program was back in fiscal year 2019 or 2020. So based on provisions in Act 33 and in this year's budget, PCCD is releasing 4 funding opportunities, including, as I mentioned before, 2 non-competitive formula-based grant programs, the Meritorious School Safety Grants for school districts and the School Mental Health Grants for eligible school entities. And there are also 2 competitive solicitations, the Targeted School Safety Grants for non-public schools and our normal competitive school safety grants. Now, another big deviation that Sam has mentioned, and I will mention again, is that board letter or minutes are not needed for approval for Activity 12 expenditures and other grant-related activities. So just go ahead and you just submit your normal physical security equipment requests as part of your application. You do not need to get an extra board letter for that. Sam, back to you.
Awesome, thanks. All right, we're in the home stretch. So if you are wondering whether or not this grant program is funded through state or federal dollars, you are not alone. As we mentioned previously, the Meritorious Grant Program for school districts is funded through state funds under the School Safety and Security Grant Program. We've also been asked whether an item that is specifically listed as a recommendation in a recent vulnerability assessment would be automatically eligible for a grant expenditure. So as we covered before, school districts can use Meritorious Grant Program funds to support any of the eligible activities, those 30 items that we keep talking about. We do encourage you to reference any assessment findings that might support your request for funds on those eligible activities, just to provide additional context for PCCD staff as they are reviewing your application. But again, you should really be going back to those activities number 1 through 30 in the law to sort of determine eligibility primarily. Finally, we've gotten a lot of questions related to supplementation, including whether grant funds could support personnel or programs that are already funded or budgeted through previous grants that are ending, whether PCCD grants or other grant funding sources. And a lot of folks have asked about positions such as school resource officers or mental health personnel and services, for example. So the answer to this question is that yes, generally speaking, PCCD does not consider requesting school safety funds for the same purpose in a previous PCCD school safety grant to be supplementation. And certainly if there's other funding sources that are ending or shifting, we would generally not consider that to be supplementation either. Do want to note, because we have so many funding announcements open currently and school districts are eligible to apply under a lot of them, we will be cross-checking applications submitted as part of this year's school safety grants funding package. So we certainly encourage you all to carefully consider which funding opportunities may be most appropriate for particular items, programs, or activities. And at a minimum, districts should really ensure that you're not requesting or submitting duplicative funding requests to PCCD. That will make our lives easier, your lives easier, and we would be very grateful for that. So as we round out today's session, just wanted to end by thanking you for your participation in today's event. We really appreciate your time and your interest. We know time is really precious, certainly for everyone, but especially for folks in our school districts. So as a reminder, a recording of today's webinar is going to be available on both PCCD's website as well as our YouTube channel, and we'll also be posting a copy of slides from today's presentation as well. We again encourage you, can't say it enough, to carefully review the written funding announcement and related materials, those helpful one-pagers, for example, that are all on PCCD's school safety website, as well as the funding announcement question and answers that have been submitted and answered to date. So if you have any lingering questions, please don't hesitate to contact our team. You can use that resource account email address that Kirsten mentioned earlier, and that's in the written funding announcement. And again, we thank you. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and we wish you the best of luck as you work to prepare your funding application. Thanks so much.